Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to begin our second day looking at Unit 4.1, Technology and Innovation, or as I like to say, the Portuguese moment. All right, so we're going to be looking at how cross-cultural interactions result in the diffusion of technology and facilitated changes in patterns of trade. All right, so we're going to kind of treat that like an LEQ, kind of essay, and basically kind of outline what that would look like today as an essay. All right, here are our standards that we'll be covering today. All right, so looking at Portuguese. And I like to just, some classes I like to kind of pause and let students read through this and just discuss, how are the Portuguese viewing themselves at the end of the 1500s. So your reading last night was from Strayer, and you were looking at specifically what the Portuguese did, right? So does this, how does this line up, right, with this? Just a word in here that you might not know is Ceylon. Ceylon is modern day Sri Lanka off the southeast coast of India today. So that's just if you didn't know what that meant. All right, so just to kind of review what we did in class yesterday. So we looked at this prompt and we developed claims on this prompt yesterday. So what I was looking for was a single claim, a single thesis sentence. Because I wasn't looking for a full thesis, if you only focused on one land empire, that was sufficient for what my expectations were. So I was looking for a category of analysis plus skill application there. All right, and just kind of a reminder what category of analysis is, where it lives, and what skill application means. So when you're approaching this particular topic, this particular prompt, keep in mind you're dealing with these land empires, right? So you're in of course, this time period of 1450 to 1750 is a time period of growing, interconnectivity with trade and communication. Because of gunpowder technology, you've got empires that are growing in size, and because they're growing in size, they're accumulating land with populated with different ethnicities and religious groups. So how are you going to deal with this new diversity within your empires? There's a kind of only a few options that we have seen in the case of the land empires. You can either force conversion, right, to your religion, which we will see in a couple of the land empires. You can enslave populations, right, of religions other than your own. That is another way that some land empires deal with that. You can also deal with it through religious toleration, which some of the land empires also did. You could have also intertwined other ways of looking at this, such as kind of interaction of outside religious influences, and then talk about things like the Jesuits. I did have one student, use use of religion, to justify rule, right? It's talking about the Manchus and the use of Neo-Confucianism, right? So it's how you approach this is kind of dependent on what you're capable of bringing to the table there. If you are writing this, it's always good to contextualize and think about contextualization. So after the fall of the Mongol Empire, this is the gunpowder will be diffused, around Eurasia and into Afro-Eurasia, and trade routes will expand, and this will give rise to these land empires that grow and rule over diverse populations, right? So then you get to your claim. There's a couple of different ways you could do this. I have a couple of examples here. So the first claim example, the Ottoman Empire, a Muslim empire, expanded into southeastern Europe, where the majority of the population was Christian or Jewish, and developed policies to incorporate these minority groups into their growing empires. Right. So, and if you were to turn that into an academic paragraph afterwards, you could then talk about the Dev Sherm, explain the Dev Sherm, talk about the 4 different ways in which people who were brought into the Dev Sherm could have gone, talk about the Janissaries, maybe talk about the Indian school, even mention the fact that Grand Viziers were sometimes coming from the Dev Sherm. Right. So you could have gone that way. Could have talked about jizya within the Ottoman Empire. We could have also talked about the millet system, right? So, the fact that some groups have dhimmi status, and then explain that. So that's kind of one way you could possibly go with that. And then I have here another Muslim empire, the Mongols controlled South Asia, which is predominantly Hindu. And then, where I go from there would really be determined by which skill I want to apply. If I want to apply similarity, then I would talk about religious toleration, and then I would probably get into things like Akbar. In my body paragraph, I could talk about, the house of worship. I could talk about, his accommodation policies, the elimination of the jizya, et cetera, et cetera. Or if I wanted to show a difference, I could talk about religious intolerance, and then I could talk about Aurangzeb and the destruction of temples, persecution of Hindus, and kind of get into that, and maybe even get into the rise of the Marathans as a result of that persecution. So, and of course, the best way to go is to do both, right? If you can, kind of use both sides of the scale, similarities and difference, then you're really demonstrating a nuanced understanding of the topic, and that is the path towards complexity. All right, so in class today, we kind of took your homework as far as kind of looking where Portugal was, and we dealt with how they got there. All right, so we're going to make this chart, and we're going to fill this chart out. All right, and and kind of keeping in mind what these words mean, and I'll go over these as we go through this. So contextualization, we're looking for big picture. I generally recommend doing contextualization before the time period that that you're writing about. Secondary causes are things that happen that inspire or help contribute, but don't necessarily have to happen before, for the event to take place, right? If it's not there. And then primary causes, you eliminate a primary cause, then the event may not even happen. All right, so your homework last night was dealing with Portugal and the introduction of Portugal into this trade network. And I gotta send a message real quick. All right, so what happens here when you're with this? And in class, I just take a few minutes to kind of talk about the homework. What do the Portuguese bring to the table when they enter into this network, this Indian Ocean network? Keeping in mind that the Indian Ocean network had been in place for, really at least 1000 BC, right? So a very, very long time that this network had been intertwined with each other. So what are the Portuguese bringing? When I asked the kids in class, probably the best answer I got is guns, right? But obviously they don't develop gunpowder technology. It's simply been diffused to them, right? So what are they coming in here with? And probably the best answer is a service, right? They're coming in with a service. So, your textbook last night talked about the idea of carrying trade. Carrying trade is what they did. So what does that mean? That means today, in a modern example of what that would be like logistics, right? They provided a logistical service. So think of like UPS, FedEx, right? Maybe the postal service. That's what they brought to the table. But they didn't come and try to compete on an equal basis with individuals who are already operating, right? So when we talk about Indian Ocean trade, we're not talking about state-sponsored activity in the Indian Ocean before the Portuguese. We're talking about, merchants, right? Merchants doing what merchants do. So when the Portuguese come in, they're going to bring an entirely new kind of tactic. So initially they will come and they will take over the ports, control the ports, control access to the ports, and they will offer their carrying service in and out of that port. And of course, they want to control all the trade, but they're Portugal and they don't have the resources to control all the trade. So they don't have the boats, they don't have the manpower to control all the trade. So what they'll do is they will develop a system to profit off from all the trade, even if they do not do all the trade. And that's where the cartaz comes into play. So you remember reading about the cartaz last night? That's a tax. So you could be charged, somewhere between 6 to 10% of the value of your cargo when you bring it into port, right? And that would give you freedom or access to beyond the port and into the ports. So that's what the cartaz is. So it's an interesting business model. And, and of course, when we talked about this in class, when we talked about this in class, we were just kind of looking at thinking about how did the merchants respond. Obviously there's going to be protests, so why didn't like the Mughals send their navy, right? And of course, this is kind of one of that contextual things, is there's no naval presence in in the Indian Ocean trade network, so there's no one to respond, right, to this once this thing takes place. So, right, so they're kind of able to do this. So they will have the Indian Ocean network, largely to themselves for most of the 1500s. There will be some battles, like for example with the Omani, right, the Muscat, here in the Strait of Hormuz, who previous to the Portuguese kind of dominated the trade between the Persian Gulf and the Swahili coast, and and of course that's ivory slaves, right, largely. So they will do battle, and by the mid 1500s that will largely be settled out in favor of the Portuguese, and you will see some Ottoman battles as well. And of course you're going to see the Ottoman trying to develop a navy in the 1500s in response to what is going on. But the Battle of Lepanto will settle that, and by the time we get to the by 1580, the Ottomans do not have a naval presence at all, right? So so by the end of the 1500s, you will start to see some European incursion other than the Portuguese. The Spanish will violate the Treaty of Tordesillas by establishing a presence in Philippines, and of course, eventually, in the 1600s, the British will develop a relationship with James I will develop a relationship with the Mughals. And then the French will come in, and the Dutch will become a major player in the Indian Ocean, especially around Malacca in Southeast Asia, what is today Indonesia, by the time we get to the end of the 1600s. All right, so, all right, and what is this all about? What do they want? All right, they want spices. All right, they want spices, and there is some competition here as far as merchants and diplomacy. Just no real naval resistance to this. All right, so, and I kind of like this little map too because it shows the dates of just how fast, Vasco da Gama, his voyage begins in 1497, and within a decade, East Africa, the Red Sea, is under Portuguese control. Go another decade, and you've got, a lot of South Asia in Southeast Asia. And by 50 years in, it's largely controlled. All right. So in class, we watched a little video on Henry the Navigator, and it's right on my YouTube here. So if you kind of scroll up, it's the video about Portugal. About 4 minutes into that video let me just kind of show you which one it is. About 4 minutes in, it's the Nazar Portuguese exploration video. And about 4 minutes in, it talks about Henry the Navigator. And of course, it's Henry the Navigator who, during his lifetime, will finance and sponsor expeditions. He creates that school of navigation, which brings all these experts together and kind of initiates that initial wave of Portuguese, exploration. All right, and all right. So when you look at, what did the world look like when Henry the Navigator initiated this? This is a very famous map. It's an Italian, made by an Italian monk, and from the mid 1400s. And I've got a video on that as well. So that's the Fra Moreau map. Right? So it's a very short video if you're interested in looking at maps. Right, so what is this? Right, so probably the greatest map of its time, highly accurate map. When you look at it, when you look at the corners, right, what do you think the corners are? First one's a Ptolemaic map of the solar system. The second one is a diagram of the four elements. Right, take a moment and look at that one. You can see the Garden of Eden is being depicted there, and the last one is Earth as a globe. Right, so kind of looking at above. How is it oriented? South is up. All right. And we've already talked about why that is the case. So what continents are missing on this map? All right. So this is made by a European pre-1492. Right. And what is at the center of this map? right? So kind of take a look at it and think. Right, so Persia is at the center. Very common for European maps, especially to put Jerusalem or near Jerusalem at the center, right? Because Christianity is at the center of their cultural life. And how accurate is that map? All right, so, it's actually shockingly accurate if you really think about it and think about the orientation that the map is created on, right? Highly, highly accurate map of the world. Right, and then later maps. So this is another map that I have on my video. This is the Walla Mueller Map. It's a German cartographer created this map, and so map making is a big part of the story, right? With Henry the Navigator, he also brings in technology, right? So you think about the Portuguese aren't inventing this stuff though. This goes back to ancient Greece. And of course, perfected by Dar al-Islam so that they could accurately pray towards Mecca no matter where they are in the world. The mapping of ocean currents and winds, right? The trade winds, and they had to do their own work on the monsoon winds. Accurate stars, right? Accurate mapping of the stars in the northern hemisphere. It's going to taking a while longer for this, for the southern hemisphere to be accurately mapped. There's no equivalent to Polaris in the southern hemisphere, so that becomes an issue. Caravel, right? So the Caravel, most of you know this because this is two of Columbus's initial ships. The Nina and the Pinta were Caravels. It contains a lateen sail, and of course it's large enough for ocean going, but also has a shallow draft so that it can go into the rivers. Right, Carax, right? So kind of a larger merchant shipping vessel. And of course, probably the most famous vessel during this time frame is the galleon, the Spanish Manila galleon, as it is sometimes referred to as. So this is one that travels across the Pacific from Acapulco, Mexico, to Manila in the Philippines, right, loaded with silver, right? That's why it's so famous, because it was attacked by pirates for silver and such. The Flying Dutchman, the Flying Flute. This is the VOCs. The Dutch East India Company's primary merchant vessel. So how did maritime exploration expand? Right, technology, Caravel, lateen sail, compasses is the tech, and new knowledge was being disseminated. That's a primary cause, of this moment in time. Knowledge from East Asia, right, in the Muslim world, Mongols, Renaissance, right, and of course state sponsorship. So these are contextual. This is some of these are contextual. This is a secondary cause. And then we see some primary causes here, right? State sponsorship and the such. And I'll explain that better in a minute. And of course, what happens next, right? This is ultimately the event, right? The event that takes place. So if we were to look at this chart and kind of take what we just talked about very quickly and put it onto a chart, what are the events we're talking about here? We're talking about Portuguese building an outpost, right, in Africa and around the Indian Ocean, focused on controlling the Indian Ocean trade network, right? So how are they doing this? Carrying trade, cartaz, controlling the ports. This is that trade post empire, right, is what they're doing. The Spanish are also sponsoring voyages and building colonial empires in the Americas. They also build, a colony in the Philippines, right, Manila. So Manila, 1571, 1603 for the entire Philippines. And then, of course, the English, the French, and the Dutch are going to begin their quest for a passage for Asia, across the Atlantic. And, of course, they're going to hit a speed bump called North America. And, the French are eventually going to colonize Canada. The English, from basically the Savannah River, up to, I guess you could say, at least the Merrimack initially river, eventually up to maybe the Passamaquoddy River, right? And of course the Dutch, the Dutch will settle in what is today New York. Very, very few students actually know that New York used to be named New Amsterdam until the 1660s, right? So, the Hudson River Valley was a Dutch colony as far as for Europeans initially. All right, so when we talk about, if these are the events that we're going to be looking at, like why does all this happen? What is the cause of all of these things to happen? One of the easiest ways to start looking at this, if you're trying to write an essay about the causes of the Portuguese Empire, is to contextualize. So the Crusades established trade connection between Dar al-Islam and Europe, in which Asian goods and ideas flowed. That's one, right? You talk about pepper and nutmeg and cinnamon. You don't have Portuguese trying to go out and do that unless they are introduced to it in the first place. So the Crusades is a very common, kind of first, thing that people contextualize. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 and the kind of rise in Islamic attitudes among the European kingdoms. The collapse of the Mongol Khanates will also result in a decrease in trade, interruptions of the supply chain, and that's going to make prices go higher, and that's going to also propel Portuguese, right, to do what they do. Reconquista, right, in Spain, and just generally increased centralization of political authority in kingdoms like Portugal, France, and England is also going to make this moment of exploration possible. And of course, in the case of the Portuguese, there's no naval presence there. Now, and that's not going to kind of motivate them to go, but it's going to help them be successful once they do arrive. You could say that there was a naval presence up until the 1430s with the Ming, remember Zheng He, but I mean, that's not really why they were there for. But they did deal with piracy, so I guess you could make a contextual connection with that, although I think that's the weakest. All right, secondary causes. So these are causes of the creation of these Portuguese empires that are important and that are influential. But if you remove these from the equation, the events probably still happen. All right. So knowledge from East Asia and the Muslim world diffused into Europe. The example I give in class is Marco Polo. Right. So if Marco Polo's book was never written, would the Portuguese have created their empire? And the answer is probably yes. Right, we know that like Christopher Columbus had a copy of Marco Polo's book with him in 1492 when he goes to the Americas. So we know that this is one of those things that inspires people. People read it and want to go and explore. But that said, it's probably not a primary cause, right? It's not gonna if that never happened, you probably still have the events. Pax Mongolica. Right, so this increase in trade is going to increase desire of goods from Asia in general. Right, so that's going to be another one of these kind of motivating factors. And of course, the Italian merchants get really rich off from Pax Mongolica. So in the Portuguese and the Spanish, are wanting to get into that trade. Right. The Renaissance, right? The Renaissance, its focus on science and curiosity is going to result in just a desire to get knowledge from wherever you can get it from. Maps, stories, right? All of that is going to be, in high demand at this time. And of course, in class, I usually stop and say, like, when you learn about this in elementary school, you learn about the 3 Gs, right? Gold, God, and glory. I think this Renaissance one is like the glory one, that kind of focus on humanism, what human beings are possible. And of course, don't you want to be immortalized like Marco Polo was? Kind of pushing people for that adventure, the unknown, right? So that they could be immortalized. And then of course, if you're going to talk about the 3 Gs, you might as well talk about Christianity. So gold, God, and glory. That's the God one. So the spread of Christianity. So in class, I did put spread of Christianity, then I broke it down into a short-term spread of Christianity. Initially, I think it's safe to say that the Portuguese motivations, as far as religion was concerned, was to stop the spread and influence of the Ottoman Empire in Islam. Long term conversion of people to Christianity, in Asia and in the Americas. And of course, we've talked about that already with the Jesuits. All right. So there's that. As far as primary causes, right? I think Prince Henry, the Navigator, and Sangra, and that's why we watched that video in class. These technologies that existed, the Caravel, the lateen sail, the compass, the astrolabe, none of them are invented by the Portuguese, but Henry brings them all together in one place, so that these merchants and these people who are on these boats, have that knowledge. And also, also knowledge in general, right, is being accumulated. New star charts, understanding currents and wind patterns, and of course, if you combine the astrolabe and the new star charts, you have the 15th century GPS. You know where you are on planet Earth. Another primary cause is, and this is kind of what starts Henry to begin with, is his desire for sugarcane plantations on islands off from the coast of West Africa. This is going to push him to explore and try to find places for those plantations, right, to grow sugarcane. And of course, eventually that's going to become a desire to directly access the Indian Ocean and, into that trade, which I guess is that gold part of it, right? So not literal gold, just spices. Spices is the gold that the Portuguese were desiring. So pepper, all right? And then, and of course, the last cause here that, that is so significant that if it doesn't exist, then this doesn't happen, is in Europe, we have state sponsorship of these expeditions, right? So in the Indian Ocean, with these land-based empires like the Mughals, we're largely just talking about individual merchants doing what they do. Whereas in the case of Europe, these are state-sponsored endeavors, right? So the government is funding these expeditions, and of course taking their cut as a result. And of course, the European kingdoms are more solidified, they're more centralized in a lot of these other land-based empires. And of course, Europeans have their own rivalries between themselves. So it's not just the fact that the Europeans are trying to cut off the Ottomans. The Europeans are also, the Portuguese are also not fans of the Spanish. They're also not fans of the Italian city-states, right? So these rivalries will push these individual states to launch expeditions. And of course, if you're going to have rivalries and tension and war between states, you're going to need to generate tax revenue. So these expeditions, right, are a way in which tax revenue is created. Right. So this is something that we did in class today, and we copied it down, and I will project for you right now just so you can see it. A copy of one of the ones that we did in class, just so you can see exactly what it was, that we went over. All right. So. And my elbow's not working. So why isn't that working? It must be frozen. All right, I'm just not going to do that. All right, so I just ask in class, and I will give you a copy of that. All right. So as far as the arrows, kind of just showing you some examples. Like some of these don't apply to everyone. So you can kind of make these specific connections if you wanted to. If you were actually doing this as an essay, you'd need to be, kind of using these individually as facts to deal with each one of these on their own merits. All right. So that's all for today. So if you weren't here, please just bring a copy of this into class next time you come in. So I did collect it and pick it up for a grade. All right, so key takeaways. European maritime expansion is more than just Columbus. All right, so it starts with the Crusades, and of course, Henry the Navigator is a major propellant of this, and of course, state sponsorship of these expeditions. All right, so make sure you can differentiate between the primary and secondary causes. So what are some of the primary causes? We just went over those. What are some of the secondary causes? Right, we just went over those. Right, so remember, European maritime expansion would eventually lead to new empires in the Americas, the Columbian Exchange. These are things that we're going to be discussing in the next week or two. And remember, being able to differentiate between primary and secondary causes is how you demonstrate nuanced understanding of topics. Once again, this is the pathway to the complexity point on the essay rubrics. All right, that is all for today. Sapriati.